Hi, this is version 1 of my Chinese dynasty tier list. We're going to be rating the dynasties off of these six criteria: territorial size, cultural achievement, social, ideological, and religious tolerance, economic situation, impact on history, and duration. Starting off, we have the semi legendary Xia dynasty. The Xia dynasty was founded by Yu the Great, who became very famous and well recognized because of his ability to control the Yellow River's flooding, and he was third in a line of three so-called sage kings. That was Yao Shun and of course Yu. And due to his effectiveness at controlling the flood, he was chosen by Shun to become the next ruler. The Xia dynasty otherwise didn't really do much, except that it collapsed in this very convenient way, in that there was a very a very cruel ruler at the end who neglected state duties. His name was King Jie of Xia, and King Jie of Xia was replaced by uh, King Tang of Shang, who was supposedly a more virtuous ruler. Now, unfortunately, with the Xia dynasty, I can only give my rating based off of what is written later about it, and I can't even use the archaeological record for it, because while there is evidence of a centralized state that existed in the area during the time that the Xia dynasty supposedly existed, um, there's no verified connection between the Xia dynasty and this said state, which is the Arlito culture, by the way. Um, However, the Xia dynasty did have some achievements that is written about later on, which is that it was the first dynasty to establish a very strong military, and first dynasty to invent bronze working, which would become very famous in the Shang dynasty. But we should also scrutinize this because um, throughout Chinese mythology, there is this idea of sage kings and cultural heroes very conveniently inventing aspects of life such as agriculture and medicine. Still, I'm gonna take what these historical records are saying at face value. I'm gonna give the Xia dynasty the benefit of the doubt and put it at A tier. Next up, we have the oopsies. How do I do this? Uh, okay, next up, I have the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty is the first historically verifiable dynasty because we have writing from the Shang dynasty in the form of oracle bones in uh, the oracle bone script, which is basically the predecessor to modern Chinese writing. And the Shang dynasty was similar to the Xia dynasty, founded by this very virtuous man called Tang, and he was very good to the people, who was very wise, and so supposedly he received a mandate of heaven, and this mandate of heaven concept is something that we'll get onto in the Western Zhou. The Shang dynasty had a lot of pretty good achievements, such as a highly developed bronze working method that was actually even higher quality than that of the much later Han dynasty. The Shang dynasty also has seen developed the Oracle Bone script and also expanded the territory a lot. However, the Shang dynasty was also quite feudalistic and practiced such things such as child sacrifice. Um, and due to its relative decentralization, um, I'm gonna put it at B tier for this. And all the critiques that I said for the Shang dynasty probably applied to the Xia dynasty if it existed. We just can't know for sure. Now, the Western Zhou dynasty was very similar to the Xia and Shang dynasties. It was founded by these two guys, I guess, a father and son duo, King Wen of Zhou and King Wu of Zhou. And these two were, of course, very virtuous men, very good to the commoners, and they supposedly received a mandate of heaven. And it is during the Western Zhou period that we see the concept of a mandate of heaven developed in order to justify their overthrowing of the Shang dynasty. The Western Zhou dynasty also saw a lot of pretty good cultural developments, such as the writing of a lot of historical texts, such as the Book of Odes, the Book of Documents. Um, and otherwise they continued the traditions of the Shang dynasty, such as bronze working, oracle bones, and feudalism. Um, Still, I think that it should be recognized greatly for its cultural achievements, and it was heavily idealized in later dynasties due to this. So I'm gonna put it in A tier also. Next up, we have the Eastern Zhou dynasty. Now, the Eastern Zhou dynasty was a result of the Western Zhou moving its capital eastwards to Luoyang as a result of a Western invasion. But quite similarly to how the Xia and Shang dynasties collapsed, this was also supposedly the result of a very poor king, King Yo of Zhou, and he was also neglected state duties. I'm not sure if this was true or not, but either way, the Eastern Zhou did have to move its capital. And what it found was that it was suddenly surrounded by all of these different states that were technically its vassals, but over time would listen to the Zhou territory less and less. And during the Eastern Zhou, there were two main periods called the Spring and Autumn periods and the Warring States periods. And both were periods of both great disunity, a lot of chaos and fighting, but also even more cultural and especially philosophical development. It's during the Eastern Zhou period that we see the rise of philosophies like Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, Mohism, and a lot of other philosophies that are commonly categorized as the 100 schools of thought. However, this was not a result of the Eastern Zhou sponsoring a lot of different cultural developments, but rather the fact that the Eastern Zhou itself was just so disorganized and decentralized. So simply because the Eastern Zhou practically was just a rump state of the Western Zhou, I'm gonna put it at F tier, just because it really didn't do much by itself. All right. Next up, we have the Qin dynasty, and the Qin dynasty is what unified China under the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. And the Qin dynasty, I think, um, it didn't last very long. It lasted only a bit over a decade, and that's because after Qin Shi Huang died, he couldn't really. No one really had his force of personality, and the commoners were really unhappy with the oppression, and they were rebelling. And the Qin dynasty collapsed pretty quickly. However, um, while its life was pretty short, its impact was pretty big, and that's because the Qin dynasty standardized a lot of things such as currency, measurements, um, what else? Cartwheels, the writing system, all sorts of things. It also conquered into a lot of territories in northern China and southern China as well. And I think um, due to its very, very big impact on Chinese history, probably more than any other dynasty, except, well, maybe a few other exceptions. But Chinese history would certainly be a lot less linear, perhaps, without the Qin dynasty's achievements. So I'm gonna put it at C tier because there's a lot of good and bad things to say about the Qin dynasty. Definitely more bad to say about it, I guess, but its impact was really, it cannot be understated. Next, we have the Western Han dynasty, which is a golden age in Chinese history. Now we have to be careful with using this term golden age. In the West, golden ages in China are divided into dynasties, but in China, golden ages are divided into the different like eras within these dynasties. But the Han Dynasty still has a lot of these golden eras per se. It was founded by Liu Bang or Emperor Gaozu after the sort of battle royale that took place after the fall of the Qin Dynasty. And Liu Bang, he was very strangely very opposed to Confucianism. He actually, I think, pissed into a Confucianist hat at one point. Uh, the early Han Dynasty really wasn't that spectacular, but it was when the emperors Wen and Jing came, and when the Han Dynasty really got stabilized, that this sort of golden age began. Under emperors Wen and Jing, why I really like these two guys. The economy flourished. There was very low taxes. They managed to keep the peace with the northern Xiongnu by simply just paying them bucket loads of money. Um, and after Emperor Wenenji come the very, very, very famous Emperor Wu of Han, who is famous because of his conquest that is into southern China and like kingdoms like Nanyue. Um, he conquered into Korea, for example, and also into the Tarim Basin. He also was responsible for mostly subjugating the Xiongnu threat. I don't love Han Wudi that much because while his conquests were very impressive, he was he was very much a tyrant. While he sponsored Confucianism, he made a lot of efforts to suppress other ideologies, and his conquests had basically drained the treasury. And as a result, the Han Dynasty also had to raise taxes and monopolize a lot of different industries, which just brought a lot of suffering to the peasants. In spite of this, after Han Wudi's reign, there comes even more. The Han Dynasty keeps on growing under emperors such as Emperor Shen of Han, and under Emperor Shen, the Han Dynasty probably peaked. And after that, it fell into the reaches of this late dynasty corruption with a lot of incompetent emperors and such. Uh, Overall, the Western Han, I think, still deserves a very firm spot in S tier. Um, it was such an impactful and very long-lived dynasty, also that actually the primary ethnic group in China is the Han ethnic group. And I think that due to its cultural, economic developments and its just overall stability, it definitely deserves its spot in S tier. Now, the reason why the Han Dynasty is split into two is due to this fellow called Wang Mang, who established the Xin Dynasty. Wang Mang is a very, very unique figure in Chinese history because he was a very radical reformer, almost like a communist, if you read about his reforms and how he redistributed the lands to the peasants and basically redid the whole coinage system. Um, but Wang Mang's Xin dynasty was basically a complete failure. It only lasted a few years. He provoked this Xiongnu threat once again, which the Han dynasty had been at peace with. The coinage system that he established was extremely confusing to use, and it actually created a black market. And overall, his reforms were simply too radical for the time, and they weren't well accepted by the upper classes. So I think the Xin dynasty, very, very well intentioned perhaps, but um, could have only worked in theory probably. So I'm gonna put it in D tier. Oh god, this is Google Slides, man. There we go. Now, for the second half of the Han Dynasty is the Eastern Han Dynasty. It's called the Eastern Han Dynasty because it transferred capitals from Chang'an to Luoyang, and it was established by Emperor Guangwu of Han. The Han Dynasty really wasn't a big step down from the Western Han Dynasty. Um, its achievements were very, very great, such as the invention of paper, and it also reconquered the Tarim Basin. And of course, there is also a golden age similar to that of Emperors Wen and Jin. Overall, pretty chill dynasty. It probably couldn't have been as great as the Western Han dynasty just because the Western Han achieved so much in its lifetime. But Eastern Han dynasty, since it also lasted about as long, which is 200 years, I think it deserves a spot in A tier, so not a big step down from the Western Han dynasty. Now, the Eastern Han dynasty had a much more violent end than the Western Han dynasty due to the Yellow Turban Rebellion and warlords and just a lot of decentralization in general with power falling into the hand of eunuchs and such. And what follows is the Three Kingdoms period, which is heavily romanticized in China due to the book The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So these three kingdoms were Cao Wei, Eastern Wu, and Shu Han. And we're going to start with Cao Wei. Cao Wei, out of the three kingdoms, it was the most powerful. It had by far the highest population, a very, very robust economy, very strong military, and just a lot of prosperity and cultural development in general. The reason for this is actually geographical. In China, there's sort of this north south divide, where the north is dominated by the central plains and the Yellow River, and the south is dominated by sort of these rice fields and the Yangtze River. And traditionally, the north, especially as far back as the Han Dynasty, traditionally the north has been the political center of China. So Cao Wei, relative to these other two kingdoms, was far more powerful, far more developed, far more prosperous, and so I think it deserves a good spot at um, A tier. Now, second of the three kingdoms is the Eastern Wu Kingdom. The Eastern Wu Kingdom was centered in southeast China, and it actually controlled a lot of territory. But unfortunately, this territory was relatively sparsely populated and didn't um, have a lot of taxable population. Um, so the Eastern Wu didn't really achieve the same things culturally as Cao Wei. However, I think the Eastern Wu should be given a lot of recognition because it was essentially the first sort of a cultural golden age of southern China, and it established a lot of the infrastructure necessary for later southern dynasties, as we'll see, to survive a lot of northern invasions. Overall, it was pretty stable. It did get invaded by the Jin dynasty later on, but I think it was still relatively good. So I'm gonna put it at B tier. Uh, and last and probably least also is the Shu Han. Shu Han is definitely glorified a lot in China because Shu Han was host to a lot of very famous heroes such as Zhuge Liang, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, Zhang Fei, and a lot of other very famous generals. But Shu Han is a testament to how heroes can't really fight against the greater trends of history. Um, Shu Han was centered in what is now modern day Sichuan, very, very sparsely populated at the time. It really didn't do much. The emperors were in general rather incompetent. Zhuge Liang did um, try some, I guess, rather desperate attacks against Cao Wei, but they pretty much flopped, and it was conquered pretty quickly by the Western Jin dynasty. So honestly, the Shu Han didn't do much compared to the other two states. It was just really weak, and its impact on Chinese history overall was very, very little. So I'm gonna put it in F tier. Oh man. Okay, so the dynasty, I mean, that briefly reunifies China after the Three Kingdoms period is the Western Jin dynasty. The Western Jin dynasty was established by Sima Yan, who was part of the very powerful Sima clan, which had essentially overthrown the Cao family in Cao Wei. This was by no means a bad thing for Cao Wei because the dynasty only really grew stronger from then on to the point where it had enough resources to actually conquer Shu Han and then Eastern Wu. So I think it should be given a lot of credit for that. But after unifying China, things didn't go very well. Um, First off, the Emperor Sima Yan, he was his empire was very feudal because he gave a lot of fiefdoms to other people. As a result, after he died, what erupted was this extremely turbulent war called the Eight Princes War, in which eight princes across the empire all rebel, and the war was extremely deadly. Probably even worse, though, was that these eight princes called in help from northern nomads, and what followed was what's known as the Uprising of the Five Barbarians, which was so devastating that it actually caused a mass Han migration to the south. So Western Jin didn't last long. It was extremely turbulent, um, but we should still give it credit for being able to unify China, even if only briefly. So I'm gonna put it in D tier instead of F tier. Next up, we have the Eastern Jin dynasty. Eastern Jin was basically after the Western Jin had mostly collapsed from barbarian invasions, and a new capital was established in the east, similar to that of the Eastern Han. But unfortunately, Eastern Jin was arguably even worse off. Um, there was a lot of very powerful clans that made the government very decentralized. There wasn't a lot of cultural development either, and the North would be dominated by what's known as the 16 Kingdoms. And it is a very turbulent period in Chinese history. There's really not much to say about it otherwise. Actually, there is one notable achievement of the Eastern Jin, and that is that it won the Battle of Fei River against the very powerful uh, Qin Qin Kingdom in the north. But that's about it. Otherwise, it didn't really do much, so I'm gonna put it in F tier. And after Eastern Qin, this fella called Liu Yu usurped the throne, and he established the Liu Song dynasty. And this is the first of what will be known as the uh, this is the first of what we'll be getting familiar with. That is the northern and southern dynasties period, which China was divided into northern and southern dynasties. And Liu Song was the first of these southern dynasties. And I'm sorry to say that these southern dynasties are really not that impressive. Um, Liu Song was extremely turbulent. It didn't last very long. Um, it did establish itself as more of a cultural presence than the North, but it wasn't even that stable compared to the North, as we'll see. So I'm gonna put it in F tier. There's not much to say about it. And following the Liu Song was a somehow even worse dynasty, the Southern Qi dynasty. This one only lasted 23 years, which is a record for the Southern dynasties, being the shortest lasting Southern dynasty. Expectedly, a lot of assassinations, usurpations, all that good stuff, and didn't do much. Very turbulent. F tier. Oops. Oh god. Okay. So following the Southern Qi dynasty, we finally get a fresh breath here. Oh god, breath of fresh air, and that is the Liang dynasty. Honestly, it wasn't even that impressive, but relative to the other southern dynasties and all that, and the Eastern Jin dynasty, it was pretty decent. Under Emperor Wu Liang, there was a pretty good cultural and economic boom. Emperor Wu Liang was very, I guess, notorious for being Buddhist. He actually wanted to run off and be a Buddhist monk for quite a few times. But I think Liang, well, it also didn't really last long. It was still slightly better than the other three southern dynasties, so I'm gonna put it at D tier. And finally, after the Liang dynasty is the last of the southern dynasties, Qin dynasty. Same story as Liu Song and southern Qi. Very turbulent. Emperors didn't last very long. Didn't The dynasty itself didn't last very long, and it was eventually conquered actually by the Norse under the Sui dynasty. So I guess same thing. F tier. Yeah. Okay. And moving to the north, we're going to start with the first of the northern dynasties, and that is the Wei dynasty, um, also known as the Northern Wei dynasty. This dynasty brought the end to the very turbulent 16 Kingdoms period. It conquered all the other kingdoms, and it was actually very, very good. There's a lot of cultural development, economic prosperity, stability, all that good stuff. Emperors were generally competent. Um, Also, like by virtue of being nomads, women's rights were also pretty good during the time. There's this very interesting sort of social tension that is present during these Turkic northern nomadic dynasties, and that is the issue of Sinicization, or like, aka adopting Han cultures and customs. Northern Wei initially tried to resist the Sinicization, but eventually it did sort of give in and become more and more Sinicized by adopting more Han style government, bureaucracy, culture. But overall, a lot better than all of the southern dynasties. And because we are judging these dynasties relative to other dynasties during the time, I'm gonna put Northern Wei actually also at A tier. Oh, and fun fact: the Ballad of Mulan was written during the Northern Wei dynasty. The Northern Wei dynasty eventually split into two halves. That is the Eastern Wei and the Western Wei. And generally speaking, the Western Wei was uh, better than the Eastern Wei. While the Eastern Wei was more prosperous, the Western Wei um, was a lot better organized, and it laid the foundations essentially for the power of the Northern Zhou and even the Sui dynasty. The Eastern Wei, on the other hand, didn't really have that many great cultural achievements. To be honest, neither of them really lived up to the legacy of Northern Wei. So I'm gonna have the Western Wei as slightly better than the Eastern Wei. because it did have more of an impact later on. So um, the Eastern Way I'm gonna put in F tier. I changed the thing. Okay. There's quite a few F tiers right now, but that's just because this is a very turbulent period in Chinese history. And Western Way I'm gonna put in just C tier. And this difference between the two is gonna be exacerbated, as we'll see. So we're gonna now have the Northern Qi, which is descended from the Eastern Way, and the Northern Zhou, which is descended from Western Way. Now, Northern Qi was similarly just not very impressive. It didn't have that many cultural developments. It wasn't militaristically very powerful either. Northern Zhou, on the other hand, was super well developed. It had a very strong military. It laid the foundations for the establishment of the Sui dynasty. Actually, had some very impressive conquests. In fact, it was the Northern Zhou that conquered the Northern Qi and even parts of Sichuan. And it's actually quite possible that the Northern Zhou could have unified China if not for a usurper whose name was Yang Jian. But I think its military achievements for um, how long it existed were still pretty impressive. So I'm going to put it in B tier. So it's simply a further development of Western Wei. And Northern Qi is going to join its predecessor in F tier. So next we have the Sui dynasty, and this is essentially the first dynasty after centuries of disunity to unify China. In many aspects, it was very similar to the Qin dynasty, in which it didn't last very long, but it had a very long lasting impact on Chinese history. Um, by unifying China, it brought upon a new golden age. It was said that under the first Sui emperor, Sui Wendi, who was actually my favorite Chinese emperor, there was enough grain that could last for decades. Sui dynasty certainly did bring the first golden age to China after centuries of just chaos and a lot of suffering. Unfortunately, it also didn't last very long, and that's because the second Sui emperor, Sui Yangdi, who was very tyrannical. He ordered the construction of the Grand Canal, which it was a positive thing for later dynasties, certainly, but a lot of lives were lost during it. And perhaps an even bigger failure was the invasion of the Goryeo Kingdom of Korea, which was two separate invasions. Both failed miserably. A lot of deaths, a lot of money was wasted, and peasant rebellions broke out all across the dynasty. So, Sui dynasty, I think it was overall better than the Qin dynasty, I'd say, which is why it belongs in B tier. And thanks to it, um, the golden age of the Tang dynasty was made possible because the Sui dynasty laid the foundations. This Tang dynasty, I decided to split it into two separate halves. That is, uh, Pre-Anshi rebellion and Post-Anshi rebellion. And part of the Pre-Anshi rebellion includes the Zhou dynasty. The Tang dynasty is pretty widely regarded as the golden age of Chinese history, and this is, of course, the first half of it. Um, there's a ton of territorial expansion in how the Tang rulers expanded deep into Central Asia to stimulate trade. It also subjugated the northern Eastern Turkic Cognate, and they even had a hand in helping the Silla Kingdom unify Korea. So military-wise, the Tang Dynasty was extremely, extremely powerful. Um, there's also a ton of cultural developments, probably most notably in poetry, with very prolific poets like Li Bai and Du Fu. The Tang Dynasty is also very special in that it is a golden age for women and women's rights. Women had a lot more rights relative to later dynasties. At this time, Neo-Confucianism hadn't taken place yet. There wasn't weird cults of like widow suicide. Foot binding wasn't a thing either yet. And women were actually allowed to be out in public without a male escort, and were also allowed to dress in different ways that instead of dressing less exposed. Um, Also, part of the Tang Dynasty was the Zhou Dynasty, which was established by the only female emperor of China, Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian's a pretty interesting figure. Um, while she was very, very cruel, um, she was a, a very, very good emperor, an excellent emperor who expanded the civil service exams, expanded the Tang Dynasty's territory, um, bolstered the economy. Very solid ruler. And the Pre-Anshi rebellion Tang Dynasty peaked under the reign of Tang Shenzong. Am I saying that right? Tang Shenzong? I don't know. Um, but under this fella, the Tang Dynasty just reached new heights. But sadly, it would be cut short, which we'll get to. But Tang Dynasty still, I think, deserves a spot in S tier, and I would personally rank it even higher than the Western Han in terms of simply cultural achievement and prosperity. Uh, so next we have the Post-Anshi rebellion Tang Dynasty. I think we should explain the Anshi rebellion first, which was this horrifically deadly, horrifically devastating rebellion started by this guy An Shan and his sidekick Shi Simin. Uh, it essentially brought the end to the Tang Golden Age. Countless people died. The census was disrupted. Government bureaucracy basically broke down. Um, it led to the military weakening of the Tang dynasty to the point that um, the Tang had to become very reliant on the northern Uyghur Khanate, and it also lost western territories to the Tibetan Empire. Now, the Anshu rebellion wasn't the end for the Tang dynasty because there was a pretty sizable economic recovery afterwards, but it really wasn't the same. In terms of religious tolerance, the I guess a post-Anshu Tang couldn't compete. The early Tang was very famous for its tolerance and its cosmopolitan nature because all sorts of people like Muslims and Koreans and Japanese people and Turks they all came to the Tang Dynasty, and under the early Tang Dynasty, Buddhism also flourished a lot. Meanwhile, the later Tang Dynasty is pretty famous for doing a 180 on Buddhism under Emperor Wuzong, who persecuted Buddhism very heavily. And although those policies were reversed, Buddhism didn't really make much of a comeback. And well, I wouldn't say that. It just wasn't very recognized afterwards, though it would, of course, maintain a very, very strong presence in China. Also, I forgot to mention, but Buddhism also spreads mostly under the northern and southern dynasties. Overall, I think the Tang dynasty it couldn't really measure up to its first half. In the second half, there was still pretty decent economic activity. It wasn't all bad, but it wasn't all great either. So I'm gonna put it at a pretty mediocre C tier. Next up, we have the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period. I forgot to add Ten Kingdoms here. And note, I'm not describing these dynasties as sort of one entity. Rather, I just find them all similar enough to sort of group them as one. But I'm so to speak evaluating all of these dynasties separately. So the five dynasties were what emerged in the north after the fall of the Tang dynasty, and none of them lasted very long at all. They were all military dictatorships, a lot of usurpations. There was surprisingly during this era a lot of cultural and economic development, but I think this was in spite of the Five Dynasties turbulence rather than because of it. Plus, the southern Ten Kingdoms were in general a lot more stable and a lot more prosperous than the Five Dynasties. So put them. I'm gonna put the Five Dynasties at F tier. They didn't really last long. They didn't do much. And I'm gonna put the Ten Kingdoms slightly higher. While they were territorially small, they were still better than the Five Dynasties in that they were slightly better governed and had a much better economy. Next up, China gets unified again under the Northern Sung Dynasty. And as you can see, the Sung Dynasty is split into two also. The Northern Sung Dynasty was another incredible golden age for China. Um, what's interesting is that Northern Song Dynasty actually had a very weak military. That's because in the north of China, actually Beijing and Manchuria, were dominated by the powerful Liao dynasty, and this Northern Song Dynasty was also unable to expand into Gansu and Vietnam. But I think the sheer cultural development and economic development that occurred during it more than makes up for it. And these are things such as um, the develop the appearance of this sort of scholar literati class and the expansion of the civil service exams, a very strong bureaucratic government, um, a lot of very important inventions such as gunpowder, the printing press, the compass, and all these. Also, the introduction of champa rice from Vietnam all made the Northern so extremely powerful and influential. Plus, of a lot of migrations into southern China, which finally makes southern China definitively the economic center of China as a whole. There's a lot of artistic developments, such as poetry, which you see in the works of like Su Shi, for example. Economic developments, such as the very famous reformer Wang Anshi, who's a bit controversial, well, very controversial, but it's pretty undeniable that he brought a pretty big surplus to the state treasury. And partially thanks to him, the Song dynasty is remembered as the richest Chinese dynasty. So I think that in spite of its relative military weakness, the Northern Song dynasty still deserves a spot at S tier because of the sheer amount of cultural and um, economic development that occurred. In fact, some argue that the Northern Song dynasty was the first modern dynasty of China, and that even that it was actually all downhill from there. This is a pretty broad argument, but I could see someone make a case for it that after the Northern Song, China didn't really appear as super strong on the global stage. So the sex, I don't know how to describe this, but the leftover state of the Northern Song was the Southern Song, and the Southern Song resided completely in the south of China. Like the traditional northern political center of China was just not part of the Southern Song. And this would normally be a pretty bad thing, but by the Southern Song's time, South China was super, super strong. And there's still a lot of economic and cultural development. Perhaps not as much as the Northern Song, though. But there is, for example, the development of Neo Confucianism under Zhu, who I personally don't like that much, but um, that should still be recognized. And for the population increased further as just rice-growing technologies improved. In response to the northern invaders, the Southern Song Navy also grew super powerful, and it was definitely more of a cultural center than the northern Jin dynasty. So, while its achievements weren't as great as that of Northern Song, I still think it deserves a spot in B tier. Oh God, uh, yeah. And so now we're gonna move to two notable dynasties in the north. Actually, three. I forgot to add one. Uh, where should I put it? Actually, I'll just put this right in front of y'all. This is the very interesting Tangut Xia dynasty or the Xia dynasty. It's pretty lame, honestly. It didn't do much. Its military wasn't as powerful as the Liao dynasty, and its economy wasn't as strong as the Song dynasty. Granted, it did have its own cultural and economic developments because it um, resided in the Gansu corridor, um, but it wasn't that impressive. It was a pretty good attempt by the Tanguts, so I'll put it at D tier. Just, just okay, just okay. And coexisting with the northern Sung and Tangut Xia dynasty is the Liao dynasty. The Liao dynasty was actually established earlier on during the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period, and it was ruled by the Khitan people, who are kind of semi-nomadic, I believe. Probably got that wrong. And they ruled in what is now modern-day Manchuria. They had a very strong military and a pretty well-developed culture that would influence later um, empires such as the Jurchen Jin and the Mongol Empire. They even developed their own script and became rather Sinicized. And overall, very solid. And it's pretty impressive how they managed to fend off a lot of Northern Song attacks and even have the Northern Song pay tributary to the Liao dynasty. So because of that, I think it belongs in B tier. Not super impressive, but it did pretty good in its own right. Next up, we have the Jurchen Jin dynasty. Jurchen Jin dynasty basically achieved what the Liao dynasty wanted to achieve, and that was conquer China, or at least part of China, which was the Jurchen Jin using its extremely powerful cataphracts and military did manage to overrun northern Song um, uh, defenses and conquer northern China. It was oddly kind of isolated culturally from the southern Song, and it didn't really become as strong as the southern Song either. But it still ruled a pretty big chunk of China proper, and I think that puts it as superior to the Liao dynasty. So I'm gonna put it at A tier. And Finally, we have the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols. And the Mongols, as usual, are quite the exception. Unlike the previous northern dynasties, the Liao and Jin, the Mongols actually successfully conquered southern Sung, the Sung dynasty. And the Yuan dynasty is pretty huge. Covers Mongolia, Tibet, Yunnan, uh, Korea, but um, it shouldn't. This military power shouldn't be overhyped because the Yuan dynasty had a lot of military failures as well, such as failed invasions of Japan and Vietnam, and even what was the island called? Java. Yeah. So And the main problem with the Yuan dynasty was simply just instability. This thing didn't last for over a century. Kublai Khan established basically this social ranking, which put Han Chinese at the bottom, which basically was just a recipe for disaster since Han Chinese were over 90% of the population. So very quickly, the Yuan dynasty was engulfed in rebellions. Not to mention, it hardly prospered as much compared to the Song dynasty. So I'm gonna put the Yuan dynasty pretty low at D tier. Very unimpressive considering how much the former Mongol empire had achieved. And second to last, we have the Ming dynasty. Uh, the Ming dynasty it arose out of the ashes of the Yuan dynasty under this very shall I say interesting guy called Zhu Yuanzhang. Zhu Yuanzhang was exceptionally smart and he was very competent and he cared for the peasants, a very good ruler and military genius. But he was pretty dang mean. He was very paranoid. He killed hundreds of thousands of people in his government purges and he made the Ming throne so that there was essentially no checks to the emperor's power. He literally abolished the position of chancellor. Now, the Ming dynasty did have some positive developments, like um, the novel, which was sort of this new writing form in China. And in the Ming dynasty, very famous novels such as um, I think The Journey to the West, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, and Dream of a Red Mansion were written. I know one of those wasn't written during the Ming Dynasty, but I'm not quite sure which. Uh, there was also pretty good development in medicine as well, and also the expansion of Confucian thought, which, by the way, isn't by itself a good thing, though. Um, the Ming Dynasty also, thanks to its relative stability, it, its economy was pretty strong and it was very rich. But it should be. Here's the big flaw of the Ming Dynasty: the government itself kind of sucked. It was out of all dynasties throughout Chinese history, at least ones that unified China. The Ming government was probably the most corrupt, and its corruption started very early on. This is not to mention the extremely poor quality of emperors in general. There's very few competent Ming emperors, and the Ming dynasty was also very poor, even though the people were rather wealthy. And I say the people, I really mean the big landlords. Due to its poorness, it's due to how badly it was run, it couldn't respond to threats very well, such as natural disasters and foreign invasion. As a result, the Ming dynasty capitulated to peasant rebellions, and eventually southern Ming was subjugated by the Qing dynasty. So, the Ming dynasty, I think, is kind of overrated. It achieved some pretty cool stuff, like the building of the Forbidden City, Zheng He's expeditions, the building of the modern Great Wall. But all of these came at a pretty great cost, and they're all mostly superficial too. So I think while the Ming Dynasty had some pretty cool achievements, it should still belong in C tier because otherwise the dynasty wasn't that impressive. And finally, last but certainly not least, the Qing Dynasty. Oh boy. The Qing Dynasty is, I think, um, very underrated actually. It's, it's often seen as a very bad dynasty because of the Opium Wars, the 100 years of humiliation, um, corruption later on. But I think it did a really darn good job. Okay, so the Qing dynasty was established by this guy called Huang Taiji, and his father was Norhatsu, who had established the later Jin dynasty, which is, by the way, the same Jin as the Jurchen Jin. In fact, he ruled over the Jin people. But yeah, Huang Taiji established the Qing dynasty and the Manchu identity, and uh, his descendants conquered China and ruled from Beijing afterwards. And the Qing dynasty is pretty notable for its relative centralization and its relatively high quality of emperors. It's pretty difficult to find a bad Qing emperor. All right, there is probably only one definitively bad emperor I can think of, and he only ruled by himself for 2 years anyway, so he didn't do that much damage. In all respects, the Qing emperors did their best, and prior to the First Opium War, the Qing dynasty was booming. Okay, um, the economy was great. The land There was a lot of land. The Qing dynasty was the biggest dynasty ever. The military was super strong, at least regionally. Um, the peasants were happy. This was the High Qing era, a true golden age of China. The emperors were very competent, taxes were low, everything was great. And this lasted for about 150 years, something like that. Great time to be alive. And then the Opium Wars come. Um, you get the Western nations that ally against the Qing. Devastating rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion. Um, Also, increased government corruption that notably only arises relatively late in the dynasty, which is after the reign of Chen, or well, arguably during the reign of Chen. But I think that the Qing response to these foreign and internal threats was still pretty good. Like, it's seriously hard to argue that, for example, the Ming dynasty would have done any better under these huge threats that were coming from the outside and inside. Uh, I think the Qing response was pretty good, such as the banning of opium and trying to modernize, such as the self-restoration movement and the Guangxu Emperor's 100 Days of Reform. And so overall, I'm going to actually put the Qing dynasty a pretty solid B tier, high B tier, because it's definitely a bit underrated. And I think that people should, when studying the Qing dynasty, scrutinize what they read about it and really look into the reasons why it collapsed and how it collapsed. And yeah, I think, well, that mindset should be applied to Chinese history in general. And that's my Chinese history tier list.